In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Please be seated. Blessings to you all on this Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday. I am so excited to tell you that next year we will welcome one of the finest preachers in the country, the Reverend Dr. Luke Powery, Dean of Duke Chapel, who has written and preached on the spirituals and on preaching hope in the midst of death. Of course, our hope was to have him with us, but not only did he have a COVID exposure, their King Day speaker had to change their plans, so there's just dominoes all over the place, and we all know what COVID how it has disrupted. So, thanks to that last-minute postponement, I am blessed and humbled to be with you this morning. I'm going to begin by doing something that Dr. King and Howard Thurman and John Lewis and others, for whom nonviolent resistance and racial justice were as much about spirit and gospel as they were about movement, I'm going to do what they did. I'm going to begin with the gospel. It's one of the core texts of the season of Epiphany, and therefore an essential piece to the story of Jesus being introduced to the world. The coming of the Magi, the proclamation of justice as Jesus' first manifesto in the temple, then his baptism, and now, what happens today, what Jesus did at a wedding to keep the party going. Right? This story, lovely as it is, doesn't really fit when we stop and think about it. The other Epiphany stories paint a picture of Jesus that is theologically sound and appropriately radical. Jesus' birth is marked by a star up in the heavens, and then his proclamation in Luke 3 to bring sight to the blind and freedom to the oppressed. That seems like the right thing for the heir of the prophetic tradition. All of those fit rather nicely, and of course his baptism is on message as well. These are all the Epiphany stories. But then he goes to a wedding and he turns water into wine. When we step back, doesn't that feel a little bit gratuitous? I mean, kind of like a party trick. You know, we can dress this up with homiletical flourish all we want, but, you know, and with apologies to our courageous friends in recovery, what really happens here is the party is winding down and Jesus takes them on a beer run. This is an Epiphany story? Jesus didn't feed anyone or free anyone or transform anyone. He just kept the party going. Is this a defining story of who Jesus is? Well, there is so much here about who Jesus is, and that is so much that there is more to Jesus than we expect. And the metaphor is about the reign of God. God's family gathers for a banquet. And there is celebration and joy and that certain sense of timelessness that comes when the party rolls into the night. Can anybody relate, having been to a wedding or a great party, and the evening goes on and you lose sense of time until you realize, oh heavens, it's time to get home? We've probably had that experience. But there's a difference here between the wine of the world, which tends to run out as the lights fade, which leaves us with headaches and sometimes worse. The wine of the world, which we tend to hoard and distribute selectively. There's a difference between that and the wine of heaven. The wine of heaven, which is spirit-filled and plentiful and tends to increase as the night goes on. It's a different kind of intoxication. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, which this morning we'll regard as scripture, Dr. King speaks of what the wedding guests tend to do once they get some of this holy wine in them. He wrote this: "In the early days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But they pressed on, in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven. They were, and here's the wine part, too God intoxicated to be intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests." But he wrote in 1963, jailed for his presence and his witness in Birmingham, facing not only a silent, white, mainline church, but also centuries of church and society that had squandered the holy wine of equality before God. Dr. King wrote, "Things have changed." Or to quote another favorite song of mine, "I cannot think of anything that makes my blood burn hotter. The people in the name of God have turned my wine to water." Jesus had given them a gift that had transformed time itself. Holy wine that in effect had changed how time flowed. Think about it. The wedding gathering was closing down. It was drawing to its end, but Jesus introduced something new. He introduced a spirit that reopened time, holy time, and drew them into an eternal, and by that I mean infinite, relationship with one another as the family of God. That is the course that Jesus set us on. But by and large, we went another way. Dr. King was writing at a critical moment in time. We are at a critical moment in time as well. And we can name any number of things that are happening now. The narrowing of access to voting, pretty much along color lines. A pandemic that has further separated poor from prosperous, pretty much along color lines. In the wake of last summer's racial reckoning, a campaign of distraction that uses the words critical race theory to make us forget the truth of those 8 minutes of oxygen deprivation in Minneapolis. This is a critical moment in time. But Dr. King wrote at a critical moment in time as well, and he talked about that. He talked about time. He talked about what we do with it and what happens, what we don't do with it. And he said that what we do and don't do, it matters. He said, speaking to those who would soften the message, he wanted to, and these are his words, reject the myth concerning time in relation to the struggle for freedom. To those who said to him, what's the hurry? Things are going in the right direction. We'll get there. He said such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Rather, he wrote that human progress comes through the tireless effort of people willing to be co-workers with God. And that without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. That work calls for courage and sacrifice and a commitment to look inward and let burn away everything within us that is not rooted in love. We cannot hide behind comfort or privilege or self-righteousness or white saviorism or any of those things, those crafty ways that we manage to hold on to power. In fact, we can start by following the steps that Dr. King gives us here in the letter from the Birmingham jail, steps that he uses to prepare for a nonviolent campaign and steps that we can read elsewhere. So 1, collect the facts to identify injustice. And I think it's telling just how much trouble we cause simply by that act of collecting and naming facts. 2nd step is negotiation. The 3rd step is self-purification. That means intense spiritual work, inward work, and finally 4, direct action. Now, somewhere between 3 and 4, between that intense inner work and then the direct action that leads to it, somewhere in the midst of those steps, things get tense. They get tense. Inner work means living with discomfort. And if we skip that step, because we're not able to look at and handle and hold discomfort, to see the pain of another human being and not run from it, to be able to sit with that. And if we're not able to do that and instead we skip right to step 4, direct action, that action can become simply about pushing our pain onto someone else. That's why this work starts and ends with the gospel. Because the action step needs to be ultimately about being a vessel for love. But love means tension too. This is the discomfort caused by a crisis that can no longer be ignored and simply must be faced. Dr. King wrote, "Nonviolent action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community is forced to confront the issue." Right? We don't want to think about a crisis as something, nobody wants a crisis. Nobody wants tension. But you know what? We have to have it if there is injustice beneath the surface. He says this creative, constructive, nonviolent tension is necessary for growth. This is tension. We need it. No tension, no creativity. No tension, no growth. No tension, no healing. This is what tension looks like. Now, you know, since this person is very much in the news right now, you know who could create some tension. Archbishop Desmond Tutu could create some tension, right? He didn't simply stop apartheid with great sermons and a joyful presence, though he had those things. He spearheaded a campaign of international disinvestment that forced the apartheid regime to the table. He knew how to create some tension. Dr. King knew how to create some tension. But I think the whole story of Jesus is about one who really knew how to create some tension in a way to transform each and every one of us. Again, Dr. King. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It comes from the kind of tension that forces those holding power into a place of realization that they cannot hold that power and stay comfortable anymore. You can't hold those two things together. And then this tension becomes almost a sacrament of reconciliation, a moment which we must all honor and hear one another. And for some of us, that means tasting the same bitterness that others have lived with in order to turn that water, that which had been something holier, back into good wine. Because that, of course, is what this is about. Returning to the banquet that God set for us so long ago, from which some of us expelled others of us, and thus gave away the very gift that was God's intention for each and every one of us. Because we start with the gospel, let's end with it, which is, of course, the whole point. If we step back and look at the whole story of Dr. King's life and ministry and witness, even the fight for freedom is about a larger story. It's about a larger biblical witness. His movement was about race, but ultimately it was about justice and human dignity. And so it was also about the scourge of poverty that affected. It didn't matter what the color of your skin was. And it was about the unchecked militarism of the United States. And all of these pointed to a world in which the sacred wine of fellowship, the gift of God in Jesus Christ, had been systematically turned back into water. His work and our work was about human dignity and restoring the image of God in each of our siblings, and thus restoring the image of God in ourselves. His work, which must be our work now, was about turning that water back into wine.